The room went cold. Cameras kept rolling. He didn't flinch. He didn't shout. He just looked at her, and the silence screamed. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The camera cut in mid-sentence. A dry click, then a buzz of ambient room tone. Most people watching at home wouldn't have noticed it. They were half listening anyway. Background noise during lunch, a live feed from another congressional hearing buried in policy terms and polite bickering. But that exact second the audio switched live, it caught something it wasn't supposed to. Karoline Leavitt leaned toward her aide. She wasn't whispering, just muttering low, the way people do when they forget the world is listening. Her mic was clipped too close. The phrase came out whole, round and slow. Putting a black actor in politics? Send him back to Africa. 3 seconds passed before anyone breathed. The aide blinked, froze, then turned his head in horror. Behind them, a C-SPAN technician sat upright in his booth. Across the room, someone's pen fell to the floor. Nobody moved. The words were still echoing, not in sound, but in presence. Denzel Washington didn't flinch. He didn't shift, didn't frown, didn't look up from his folder. He sat in a clean gray suit, palms resting on the table, a thin silver cross catching the light beneath his collar. For 3 hours he had been silent, not ignored, just waiting. He was brought in under executive order, a civic liaison for education equity, not an actor on tour, not a pundit looking for airtime, just a man who'd seen too much to speak before it counted. The chairman coughed. "Let's return to the issue at hand," he said weakly, shuffling some papers that didn't need shuffling. Karoline reached for her water, her face frozen in practiced disinterest. But the redness creeping up her neck betrayed her. She knew. Outside that room, it took less than 40 seconds for the clip to hit the first timeline, a screen recording from a teenager watching the hearing in real time. No edits, no captions, no commentary, just the raw, jagged moment, ending on Denzel's stillness. Then another upload, then another, then it caught fire. Inside the chamber, nobody knew yet. They just felt it, a tension thick enough to sit on. A black intern near the back sat up straighter. The aide beside him said nothing, just glanced toward Denzel. He still hadn't moved. Then he did something small. With 2 fingers, he reached to his collar, slipped the chain holding his cross up and over his head, and placed it gently on the folder in front of him. He didn't speak, didn't look at Karoline, just stared ahead, through her, past her, into a space bigger than that room. The silence wasn't awkward. It wasn't even hostile. It was holy. Someone sniffed. Someone shifted their chair. The chairman tried again. "Let's proceed, Mr. Washington, if you're ready." He didn't respond. Not with words. He opened the folder slowly, flipped to a page, took a pen from his breast pocket, and wrote one short line. Then he closed it. That was it. The aide beside Karoline leaned in. "Mike's hot," he whispered. She didn't answer. Her knuckles were white against her water bottle. Every instinct told her to deny, deflect, distract. But she stayed quiet. Something in the way Denzel had just looked through her, without blinking, without anger, without need, made it clear. She wasn't dealing with outrage. She was dealing with weight. In a production room 2 floors above, a social media intern at the Capitol Communications desk pulled her phone from her bag, opened Twitter, and paused. She'd heard the clip. She knew what was coming, but it wasn't the slur that gave her goosebumps. It was the pause after, the part where no one rushed in, no one saved the moment, no statement, no screaming, just exposure, raw and wide open. In Kansas City, a middle school civics teacher muted the TV, rewound the stream, then hit record. In Santa Fe, a barbershop fell quiet as the live feed looped overhead. In New Orleans, a single mother scrolling through her lunch break stopped mid-swipe and whispered, "Did she just?" The country was listening now, not because of what she said, but because of what he didn't. And somewhere inside the Capitol, still seated, still silent, Denzel Washington wrote one more word beneath the first line in his folder, then folded his hands and waited. She tried to act like it didn't happen, like no one had heard it, like it was all still salvageable if she kept her posture straight and her voice calm. Karoline Leavitt sipped from her bottle, flipped through her papers, adjusted the mic like a technician might come fix the world for her. But the soundbite had already left the room. It was out there now, living its own life, spliced into reaction videos, slowed down, captioned, dissected. She didn't control it anymore. Denzel hadn't spoken. That was the part no one could stop talking about. The internet had already named it, the look. No caption needed, just a still frame of his eyes, focused, calm, immovable. People looped it, freeze-framed it, overlaid it with quiet gospel music. There was something ancient in it. Not performance, not restraint, something else. Something that made you feel like you were being seen for the first time in a way you might not survive. A journalist tweeted, "He didn't blink," and somehow that said everything. Back in the chamber, the hearing continued as if it hadn't just cracked something wide open. Denzel's name was called again. This time he looked up, slowly, deliberately. His voice was low but carried. "I'd like to speak now." Every pen in the room paused mid-stroke. He didn't address her. He didn't need to. He looked straight ahead as if speaking through history itself. "So let me be clear," he said. "This conversation isn't new. The context may shift. The rooms, the microphones, the faces, but the current underneath stays the same. We're not debating numbers. We're debating who deserves to belong." Karoline looked down. Her hands trembled, just barely. Someone tried to interject. A staffer passed a note, but Denzel kept speaking, not with volume, but with precision. "There are people in this country who've spent their entire lives being told they are guests in their own home, that they must prove something to earn air, to earn respect, to earn their place." He stopped, let the silence hold, and then when we dare to sit at the table, someone mutters under their breath. A soundless intake of breath rippled through the room. He didn't say her name, didn't quote her, didn't need to. Everyone had heard, everyone had felt it. He reached toward his folder, not to open it, just to rest a hand on top. His cross lay there, still shining under the fluorescent lights. He glanced at it just once, then he looked up. "I won't respond to what was said." The room tensed. Then he added, "Because it wasn't said to me. It was said about all of us, and we've been responding to that for 400 years. The air cracked, not with applause. This wasn't a movie. Not with gasps. People had run out of breath. It cracked in the way glass does under pressure, when something old finally gives way. Karoline adjusted her mic again, this time more nervously. She knew she couldn't say anything. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Reporters in the back were already typing with frantic urgency. One leaned to another and whispered. He just reframed the whole thing. Outside the building, cars honked without rhythm. A crowd was forming. People who'd seen the clip on their phones and showed up without knowing why. Just to be there. Just to feel it. And still, Denzel hadn't raised his voice. Still, he hadn't called anyone out. Still, he hadn't moved a muscle more than necessary. But he had done something far more dangerous. He had told the truth, the kind that doesn't go viral because it's shocking. It goes viral because it's been waiting for someone to say it without shouting, waiting for someone to say it and stay seated, waiting for someone to say it and not ask for applause. Denzel picked up his pen, placed it back in his pocket, closed the folder, and leaned back. He folded his arms, let out a breath, then he said nothing else, because now he didn't need to. That night, he didn't turn on the news. He didn't scroll. He didn't pick up the phone even as it buzzed non-stop. Friends, colleagues, journalists, strangers. He let it all hum in the distance, background noise to something deeper. Denzel sat by the window in his hotel suite, the kind of government-issued room with stiff chairs and silence built into the walls. He had the lights off, just the glow of the city bleeding through the glass, and a half-empty glass of water in his hand. There was a quiet knock at the door. He didn't need to ask who it was. When he opened it, his mother stood there. Lennis Washington, still sharp, still graceful, still watching her son like she could see straight through to his soul. She didn't say much. She never did. Just stepped in, set down a small plastic bag with a Tupperware of food he probably wouldn't eat, and took off her coat. They sat at the tiny table near the window. For a while, neither spoke. Finally, she asked softly, "You're going to say something?" Denzel looked out the window. The lights of D.C. shimmered across his face. He was quiet for a beat longer, then nodded. "Yeah," he said, "but it won't be what they expect." She tilted her head, the same way she did when he was 10 years old and caught lying about skipping homework. "It better not be what they want. It better be what you believe." That landed. He turned, looked at her. "You remember what Dad said when we visited the Supreme Court?" he asked. She smiled faintly, already knowing the answer. "He stood there," Denzel continued, "looked up at the dome and told me, 'This belongs to you too.' He laughed once under his breath, more like an exhale. I was 11. I didn't believe him. Not really. I still don't some days." His mother looked at him, firm and unwavering. "That's exactly why you need to speak." He nodded again, slower this time. The kind of nod that didn't just agree, it committed. She stood after a while, kissed the top of his head, and left without another word. He stayed seated. The city moved without him. Sirens in the distance, the hum of elevators, the soft rhythm of hotel doors closing somewhere down the hall. But inside, everything was still. He opened his folder again, stared at the line he'd written earlier that day. No one can take your place unless you give it to them. Underneath, in smaller writing, he added something new. This isn't about responding, it's about remembering who we are. He sat back, let the pen fall to the table, and just listened to the silence. The briefing room was already full when he walked in. No entourage, no handlers, no script, just Denzel Washington, holding a plain black folder, moving with the same quiet gravity that had followed him since the moment that mic caught fire. Cameras clicked. Reporters murmured. Staffers paused mid-sip of burnt coffee. Everyone knew something was coming. They just didn't know what it would sound like. He stepped to the podium and didn't speak right away. He opened the folder, glanced once at the page inside, then closed it again. "I had something prepared," he said, voice low even, "but I don't think I need it." That was the moment. Not because he improvised, because it meant he trusted the room to hear him raw. What happened yesterday, he continued, wasn't new. He scanned the press, not with challenge, but with clarity. There was no tension in his brow, no shake in his voice. Just a man standing where he wasn't always allowed to stand, saying what too many had carried in silence. "I've heard that line before," he said. "Airports, casting calls, elevators, studio lots. They didn't always say it out loud, but they meant it." He let that hang, then added, "So when people ask if I was shocked, no. What caught me off guard was that some folks still think this kind of thing is rare, that it's a slip-up, that it's accidental, like this isn't America." In 2025, he leaned in, just slightly, enough to pull the room forward. "I want people to understand something. When you tell someone to go back, you're not questioning their citizenship. You're questioning their right to exist in the first place." He didn't blink. "I'm not going anywhere." You could hear the shutter clicks double in speed. You could feel every throat tighten. That line, 4 words, hit harder than a speech ever could. It didn't demand applause. It didn't chase sympathy. It just stood. He went on. "My father once brought me here to this city, when I was a kid. We stood outside the Supreme Court, and he looked up at that building and told me, 'This belongs to you too.' I didn't believe him. Not really. There are still days I don't." He paused. "Not for drama, just to breathe. But I came anyway. I serve anyway. I speak anyway. Not because I was invited, because I don't need permission." A silence followed. That wasn't heavy. It was clean, like the air after a storm. He looked down, then back up. "I'm not here to shame Karoline Leavitt. I'm not here to cancel anybody. I'm here to remind every person watching that you don't have to be perfect to belong. You don't need a pedigree to participate. We belong because we're here, because we build, because we serve, because we believe. Our ancestors helped shape this country as much as anyone's did." He let that sit, then finished. "And if that truth makes someone uncomfortable enough to say what she said, then maybe it's their discomfort that needs to be examined, not my presence." He stepped back. No questions, no spin, no smile, just a folder tucked under one arm, and the same quiet that had followed him in. He walked out like a man who didn't need to win the moment, because he'd already carried it. It didn't take long. By the time Denzel stepped out onto the sidewalk, his words were already circling the country like a pulse. Quiet, steady, undeniable. Not in breaking news banners or shouting heads on cable, but in smaller places, quieter ones. A diner in Tulsa, a church foyer in Macon, a high school hallway in Detroit, where someone whispered, "Did you hear what he said?" And another nodded, "I felt it." In a barbershop in Mobile, Alabama, the clippers were turned off mid-fade. 5 men stood around a dusty old TV, replaying the press conference again and again and again. One of them, maybe in his 60s, arms folded across his chest, finally spoke. "Back in my day," he said, "you either yelled or you swung." He pointed at the screen. "He did neither. That takes more strength than people know." In Flagstaff, Arizona, a Navajo teacher paused her social studies class, dimmed the lights, and projected the clip against the whiteboard. Her students were quiet. At the end, she didn't say a word, just let it sit there like a lesson. In a middle school in Boise, a 5th grade girl sat down after lunch and wrote a letter. It was short, just a few sentences, with a crayon drawing taped to the bottom. In it she wrote, "You talk like my grandpa, calm but strong. I miss him. I think he would have liked you." That letter ended up taped to Denzel's office wall. He didn't post it, he didn't share it, but he kept it. Because that was the point. It wasn't about trending. It wasn't about going viral. It was about what stayed behind when the screens turned off. In a dusty VFW hall outside Fresno, a retired white veteran named Bill logged into Facebook for the first time in over a year. He didn't tag anyone, didn't share the video, just typed one sentence. He didn't just speak for himself, he spoke for all of us. It got 2 likes, and it was enough. The reaction wasn't loud, it wasn't fast. It was slow and steady, like rain soaking deep into dry ground. People weren't screaming, they were remembering, they were repeating, they were showing their kids. In Memphis, a pastor changed his Sunday sermon, threw out what he had planned, read Denzel's line out loud to the congregation, "You don't need permission," and they said amen like they'd been waiting years to hear that from someone who looked like them and stood in a room that rarely did. Not everyone agreed, of course. Talk radio hit back hard. A host in Des Moines barked into the mic, "Here we go again." Manufactured outrage. Another actor playing the victim. Callers rang in. Some cheered. Some pushed back. One caller said, "He didn't throw a tantrum. He told the truth, and you just don't like how that sounds." But none of that touched what was really happening. What was happening had no hashtags. It was showing up in unexpected places. It was showing up in a grocery line in Vermont, where 2 strangers looked at each other and said, "Did you see what he said?" And both smiled, quietly. It was showing up in a university hallway in Atlanta, where a white professor paused at the office door of her black colleague and said, "I just wanted to say, thank you for the work you do," and then walked away. It was showing up in the back of a city bus in Cleveland, where a kid stared out the window with earbuds in, watching the clip for the 3rd time, not because he missed it, but because he needed to feel it again, not because Denzel shouted, but because he didn't. That silence, his silence, was still spreading, still changing rooms he'd never walked into, and he knew it, because truth doesn't need an encore, it just needs time to settle. Karoline Leavitt didn't leave her townhouse that week. She barely left the 2nd floor. The windows stayed closed, the blinds drawn. Her phone buzzed nonstop the first 2 days. Calls from donors, messages from party officials, frantic PR firms offering crisis playbooks. But she didn't answer most of them. Not because she didn't know what to say, because she already knew what they'd say. Her team released a statement by the end of day 1. Smooth, defensive, written by someone paid to sound empathetic without ever admitting fault. Background noise, misinterpreted, taken out of context. But the internet had heard it clearly. The pause, the tone, the way her voice curved at the end. There was no confusion, there was just clarity. Brian, her longtime aide, didn't say much either. He sat by the window with his laptop open but untouched. The headlines were relentless. The clip wouldn't die. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was real, unedited, uncovered, undeniable. By Wednesday night, she watched the press conference again, alone, laptop on her knees, hair pulled back, sweatpants on, no filters, no prep, just her, watching the man she tried to dismiss walk into a room and dismantle her entire stance without ever saying her name. She played it again, paused it, rewound it. The line came back like a wave. "I'm not going anywhere." She whispered to herself, "I didn't mean it like that," but it didn't sound convincing. Across the room, Brian finally looked up. "You know what the problem is?" he said calmly. "It's not what you said. It's that you didn't think twice before you said it." She stared at him. "It just came out." He nodded slowly. "That's the part people heard loudest." She didn't respond. Just let the video play again. Watch Denzel walk out of that press room without flinching, without smiling, without trying to win, just standing. And somehow that made her feel smaller than any headline ever could. The next morning she canceled a planned interview. Then another. She turned down an op-ed. She deleted a drafted apology that didn't feel like hers. And then for the first time in her political life, she didn't reach for control. She just sat. Later that week, she walked into a closed-door meeting with a youth education group in Ohio. No cameras, no handlers, just voices she hadn't heard before. A young Latina woman across the table leaned in and asked her directly, "What changed?" Karoline didn't deflect, didn't spin. She looked down, breathed once, then said quietly, "Getting caught didn't change me. Getting challenged did, and I'm still figuring out what that means." There was no applause, no viral moment, just a silence that felt earned, because sometimes the most powerful shift doesn't happen when you're called out. It happens when you finally hear what you've been ignoring all along. 2 months later, the headlines had moved on. Another scandal, another election poll, another shouting match on cable news. Congress was back in session, fluorescent lights humming, lobbyists circling like clockwork. Everything looked the same. But something had shifted, subtle, quiet, but real. Buried on page 9 of the daily legislative report was a small item that barely caught attention. House Bill 4221 passed by bipartisan vote. Title, Federal Funding Equity in K-12 Education. Co-sponsored by Denzel Washington. Voted in favor, Karoline Leavitt. There were no speeches, no press releases, no handshake photo, just 2 names printed side by side, quiet, undeniable. Down the hall, a congressional intern reading the report looked up and smiled to herself. "That's the one," she whispered. Elsewhere, far from Capitol Hill, the moment still echoed in unexpected places. In Charleston, South Carolina, a high school civics teacher started her semester differently. No textbook, no lecture. She wheeled in a TV, dimmed the lights, and pressed play on Denzel's press conference. When it ended, she stood at the front of the room and asked, "What does it mean to belong?" A student in the back, a boy who rarely spoke, raised his hand. "It means," he said, "you don't have to explain why you're here." No one replied. They didn't need to. In Santa Fe, a TSA officer paused Denzel as he passed through security, gently touching his arm. "You reminded us," she said softly, "what power looks like when it's quiet." He gave a small smile, the kind that carries a lifetime. Didn't think it would echo that far. She nodded once. It did. In D.C., things looked the same. Same marble steps, same cameras waiting for conflict. But in the halls of Congress, the nods he received had changed. Not fearful, not performative, just different, grounded, a quiet recognition. One congressman from Montana stopped Denzel near an elevator. Gray suit, conservative lapel pin, weathered eyes. "You didn't just defend yourself," he said. "You defended a whole lot of folks who never had a mic." Denzel nodded. That was the point. And Karoline? She disappeared from the front pages by design. No teary interviews, no podcast redemption arcs. She stopped going on TV, started showing up to private sessions with education advocates, started listening. At one of those sessions, a college student asked her again, "What changed?" She didn't dodge. "Getting caught didn't change me," she said. "Getting challenged did, and I'm still figuring out what that means." There was no applause, just a moment, and that was enough. That fall, something else passed. Not a law, not a resolution, a shift, a reminder that dignity doesn't need volume, that some stories don't end with noise but with weight. Not every victory is loud. Sometimes it sounds like nothing at all. And maybe, just maybe, that's why we remember it.